Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Makowski, and joining me from the great city of Charleston, South Carolina, is my friend Walt Young. Walt, how are you today?
I'm very well and glad to be here.
Always glad to have you with us. And we've been talking about the cities of war in preparation for the 11th annual Emerging Civil War Symposium at Stevenson Ridge, coming up at the beginning of August, focusing on that theme of the cities of war. And I've asked Walt to come in and kind of share another city of war story that we're not going to cover at the symposium, but I thought was really kind of cool for us to perhaps talk about. And that's the story based in Charleston about Robert Smalls. Um, so first, Walt, before we kind of get into Smalls' story, let me just ask you a big, underhanded softball question. What do you like about being a historian in Charleston?
I think that among the places I've lived, there are very few that can measure up to Charleston in terms of the amount that it informs our entire history. You can go to Charleston and see the factors that led up to our revolution and see how we beat back the British in a battle in 1776, right before our Declaration of Independence. You can see plantation sites and historic houses that really are going to inform the biggest, I think, the divide that leads up to the Civil War and the growth and expansion of slavery in the United States. And you can see the results of that, obviously, with the first shots of the Civil War at Fort Sumter, the target of the first shots, and how over the course of the Civil War, we see both bravery and sacrifice, but we also see the changes of the war, the destruction of the war, and the new birth of freedom that will ultimately come out of it. I think Charleston is an amazing place to explore all of that. You've got history right at your fingertips, and I would highly recommend for anyone who hasn't been the chance to come down.
All that and a great food city too, I'll
Well,
also
exactly.
say.
Barbecue, seafood, southern cooking. You can't go wrong.
So the first time I came across the story of Robert Smalls, I was actually walking down along the Battery, and there was a state historic marker near the yacht club, and has two sides that tell the story of Robert Smalls. I thought this is fascinating. Give us a quick little synopsis of who Robert Smalls was.
All right. So at the time of his famous escape in 1862, Robert Smalls was 23 years old. He had been born into slavery on Ladies Island, which is a little bit south of Charleston, near the town of Beaufort, which is also a very important city for the war. And he was being what we might call hired out to a Confederate contracting ship called the Planter. So this is an opportunity for him in a way to make a little bit of money to try and buy the freedom of his wife, Hannah. They had two small children, and she had a couple of children of her own. And she is going to be, not by choice, a part of the Confederate war machine in Charleston over the early part of 1862. The planters can be bringing stuff around the harbor to Confederate positions that are being reinforced, like Fort Sumter or Fort Moultrie or earthworks at Fort Johnson and Morris Island, and positions that are being built, called like something called Battery Ripley in the harbor. So Robert Smalls is going to be in a position to see the places where the Civil War began, and as it turns out, is going to be in a position to change in a way what the war might be about.
Now, this story takes place, as you said, in 1862. What's the state of Charleston at that point in the war? Because, of course,
Mhm.
there's been the secession convention, there's been
Yes.
Fort Sumter.
Mhm. So this is the first half of the Civil War in Charleston after the Confederate firing on Fort Sumter is actually the quieter half of the war in Charleston. But that's not to say there aren't important things going on. For one thing, the Confederates are always going to see this as a very symbolic city because it's the place of the first secession convention and the what they consider the beginning of their glorious war for independence. But things are already starting to shift a little bit. There is a U.S. blockade outside the city. President Lincoln ordered the blockade a week after Fort Sumter, and that has begun to show up. The U.S. has attempted to sink ships filled with stone off the harbor to try and begin putting pressure on the Confederates a little bit. There's been an accidental fire in downtown Charleston in late 1861 that actually destroyed the secession hall where they had announced their secession just under 1 year later, which I think there might be a little irony there.
A little too much fire breathing, huh? Yeah.
Perhaps that's a good point. Yeah, and maybe foreshadowing. And in the city's newspapers leading up to May, you're seeing the march toward actually a Confederate city that will go under martial law. The Confederates are starting to get frustrated with the economic problems that will plague them throughout the war. And they are going to turn to putting Charleston under martial law right at about the time of Robert Small's escape. Not because of the escape, but mainly because of for economic controls they were trying to impose. There are actually some newspaper accounts that are getting angry at the blockade runners who were kind of their lifeline for prices that they considered too high, which might you might ask what economic theory they were thinking of, but I think they might have been turning the blame toward the wrong sources in that case.
Supply
So
and
yeah,
demand just not.
definitely not under the long siege that's going to dominate the later part of the war. But definitely things are not easy in the new Confederacy even now.
So, what is it that brings Smalls into Charleston, into the situation where he's able to kind of get a view of all these defenses and fortifications?
Mhm. As a relatively young man, he had been sent to Charleston to be, we call it, quote unquote, hired out by his owner, who was a man named Henry McKee from the Beaufort area. Smalls's mother was a woman named Lydia, and his father is actually unknown. There are some people who have argued that his father may have been Henry McKee himself, but that is not confirmed. So he being hired out is a way for the slave owner to make some money off of this arrangement. But it might be the way for the enslaved worker to make a little bit of money themselves. I want to stress that he definitely was still enslaved. This was not something that every slave had the chance to do, but it still doesn't mean that he has legal freedom. But it does mean that he's going to gain experience on harbor ships, expertise that is going to come in handy for his escape and his later war service. So he is in a position that he will use to his advantage. I mentioned earlier that he was hoping to help his wife get out of slavery. She was also enslaved, and we estimate that he would have needed several $100s, which was a large sum for an enslaved worker, of course, in order to try and purchase her freedom. So it was a time that he hoped would be a turning point in his life, and I think succeeded in that eventually beyond his wildest dreams.
Yeah, yeah. Now you mentioned that he gets valuable harbor experience. Now, my
Mhm.
experience in Charleston Harbor is taking the ferry out to Fort Sumter and back. Always
Mhm.
lovely to be out on the harbor. Maybe you see one of the giant cruise ships come in. I've stood on the deck of the USS Yorktown. So, in other words,
Yes.
my experience in Charleston Harbor is pretty limited.
Yes.
What was Charleston Harbor like in 1862 with the blockade going on?
So Charleston Harbor has always, until the Army Corps of Engineers, who for the world is their sandbox, moved things around quite a bit in the 20th, late 19th, early 20th century. Charleston Harbor is a very windy harbor. So it's tough to describe this on a podcast, but the city is a peninsula that is basically a U shape at its southern end. And it is hidden into the harbor a little bit by these nearby barrier islands and kind of flanking peninsulas. And so, if a ship wants to come into Fort Sumter, they've got to start from the ocean, but they're not taking a straight ahead path. They are going to be turning quite a bit as they pass by, for example, Morris Island in your main shipping channel. Fort Sumter is placed where it is so that it is a bottleneck into the harbor. and a ship would usually have to pass that, past Fort Moultrie across the water on Sullivan's Island, the flanking barrier island, and then make some slalom turns through the harbor past interior positions like Fort Johnson and Castle Pinckney. So there are a lot of forts that have been built over Charleston's history, both in the colonial era and by the United States, and then by the Confederacy, that are going to be working together as a team by 1862 for the Confederates against any U.S. ships beyond.
So that's one
And
reason why the blockade actually stays outside the harbor
the
because
blockade is going to be outside the harbor. So the forts are, as it turns out, over the course of the Civil War, largely pretty successful at keeping the blockade away from the city itself. And at this point in the war, the Confederates basically hold all the nearby islands, and the United States ships are just offshore. So during his usual service, what that means for Robert Smalls is you've got a lot of very shallow areas in the harbor where an experienced boatman like him is going to know that you can't take it, you can't run a ship into, or else you are going to be up a creek might be the wrong term, but up a sandbar, and
you'll
as a
be up
result,
the
of course,
Ashley River without a paddle, right?
up the Ashley River without a paddle. That's a good way of putting it. And what it'll mean for his escape is that if he is going to eventually sneak past all these forts, he is going to have to take a pretty defined path that is going to take him directly under the guns of some fairly dangerous positions.
Now, you had mentioned Castle Pinckney, and you'd also mentioned just sandbars in the middle of the harbor. And Castle Pinckney is a great example where here's a spot of the harbor that is so shallow that there's a permanent sandbar that they could build a fort on. you know,
Yes, very
and
much so. And earlier, like even before Castle Pinckney existed, it had been that island, Shoots Folly, had been kind of a trade like a trading area. So yeah, these are no joke. And one example I enjoy is in the Revolution, the British are going to have this grand plan to take over Charleston from the Patriots. And one of the things that goes awry for them is they run 3 of their 9 ships into a sandbar that today is on the site of Fort Sumter. So even very experienced naval officers, if you don't know where you're going in this area, it can be a serious challenge. And think about for the Confederacy, if they're bringing people from naval officers from all over the Confederacy who have been sailing in many places, sometimes in an earlier career for the U.S. Navy, they might not always know Charleston very well. And they're going to often rely on local pilots in order to get them around. And in some cases, such as on the Planter route, those pilots will be enslaved.
And I think it's just sort of important to underscore, if you go to Charleston today and you see one of those cruise ships go up and you think like, oh
Right.
gosh, the giant ships can go all the way up.
Mhm.
And that's really sort of deceptive as to just how shallow most of that harbor is because they have that canal dredge or that channel dredged.
Correct. It's been made intentionally much easier by the Army Corps of Engineers. It's basically a straight shot nowadays, and that is not how it would have been at all.
Yeah. Now, Confederates are occupying Fort Sumter at this point as well. Tell us
Mhm.
just a little bit about, kind of what's at the mouth of the harbor as they
Mhm.
occupy that facility.
Yep. So flanking the mouth of the harbor, you've got 2 barrier islands. You've got Morris Island and Sullivan's Island. And in between them, Fort Sumter had been built on a sandbar over the course of about 3 decades, the 1830s through the 1850s. It was, as your listeners will know, the one United States position in the harbor that was fired upon by Confederates from basically all the other island positions I've described, uh, and taken over. And so it is going to be the centerpiece of harbor defense at this point in the war for the Confederacy, and will be also kind of a point of pride for the Confederacy that they had taken over this position and they had that it was the beginning of their war. It As a result, the bottom you can only get by Fort Sumter basically on the side closer to Sullivan's Island, and they've done a lot to block parts of that channel. So it's going to be a pretty narrow path that takes you almost directly next to Fort Sumter in order to pass by, and they can shoot at any unwanted ship, whether it be a U.S. ship getting into the harbor or any suspicious vessel they think might be leaving. that does not have authorization to cross. So they had created a system of signals in order for ships to go by with permission from the lookouts at Fort Sumter.
So it's important to kind of lay out this gauntlet that at some point Robert Smalls decides, yeah, I got this, right?
Mhm.
So what's
Yeah.
the precipitating event that decides for him that he's going to make a break for him?
Mhm. One of the other members of his crew will eventually say to a newspaper that they had noticed the behavior of the Confederate crew over a several week period. There were three Confederate officers on this ship, and the remainder of the crew were enslaved workers. And these Confederate officers had decided, for one reason or another, to let's say skip their homework and go into the city of Charleston overnight. This is not what their bosses would have said they were supposed to be doing. They would have said that they were supposed to be guarding this ship. The planter is not Confederate military, but it does carry Confederate military equipment. And on the night in question, it will be carrying six cannons, two for its own armament and defense, and four that are supposed to be placed at positions around the harbor. So it is a sensitive place that you like any military base today might be, that you probably want at least some lookout staying back on as military personnel. But since all three of them are now leaving the ship, Robert Smalls and other crew members are going to be able to see an opportunity. So they are going to start planning, and they're going to put their plan into action on the night of May 12th, leading into the morning of May 13th of 1862.
So they've been watching these Confederate officers. They've got a sense of who they are. Oh,
Hmm.
here's an opportunity.
Yep.
Is this like a super spur of the moment thing, or have these guys thought like, hey, if an opportunity should ever come up, we're going to try this?
Mhm. I think there's a combination of seizing the opportunity, but I do think there is some planning. So I'm going to quote a man named Alfred Gordine. He is a member of the crew, and this is a newspaper interview that he's going to give many years later. He says, "We quote: We could have carried out our plan several days before we did, but Robert Small wanted to carry something besides the steamer out to the Yankees. We were daily engaged in transporting guns and munitions, and he had his eye on four big guns, which he knew were to be taken down the harbor to a new fort on the middle ground." And that position for anyone, for any nerds who know the harbor, ends up being called Battery Ripley. So I think there is planning that goes into this for sure. It is not. It's a combination of I'm fed up. I know these guys are right off the harbor, U.S. vessels, and I have an opportunity to get my wife and kids to freedom. But it also is, I think there's some calculation in I'm going to do this at the exact right time that is going to maximally hurt the Confederate war effort to the extent I can. So I think there's a lot of intelligence and planning that really shows who Robert Smalls is that goes into this mission.
So he's getting his ducks in a row. So when the opportunity does come up, he's ready to go
Mhm.
and take full advantage of it.
Very much so, yes.
So this happens on the night of May 12th. Can you walk me through the events? Step by step. Tell us this story.
Yep. So once the officers have left, they are going to prepare for departure. By about 11 a.m., they're going to start collecting a couple of family members. So Robert Smalls is going to have four family members with him. He's going to have his wife, his two children, and his stepdaughter Clara. One other crew member, John Small, will have his wife and infant child go with him. They are going to be first docked at the southern wharf, which is near the bottom of the peninsula. They're actually going to go up just a little bit to the North Atlantic wharf to pick up the family members, and they are going to wait. Ms. Gordine says that a fog settled down at about 10 o'clock, and even had Smalls decided to go out at night, this would have been prevented. So this was waiting. They eventually, though, decide they are going to make a run for it, and they're going to do so about 3 a.m. In order to do this, they have to then exit the North Atlantic Wharf. and start passing by these positions. First, Castle Pinckney, then Fort Johnson along James Island on the western side of the harbor, and then, this is the most important one, in between Fort Moultrie and Fort Sumter. And here is Gordine once again. He says, "What we had talked over and what every man fully realized was that the real crisis would come when we passed Fort Sumter. We'd then been down the bay occasionally, and the steamer was well known to all. In other words, it's not going to be a problem if you're just sailing from one point in the enclosed harbor to another. So Castle Pinckney and Fort Johnson are going to be used to seeing ships go by. But Fort Sumter is the bottleneck. If you go by there, you're either going to Morris or Sullivan's Islands, or you're going to the blockade. So they know that the people at Fort Sumter are going to be suspicious if they put a foot wrong. There was a danger too that a boat might put off to us on some legitimate errand. So getting sidetracked to actually run a real mission for the Confederacy. So they don't want to do that either. When we drew near the fort, every man but Robert Smalls felt his knees giving way. The women began crying and praying again. Smalls kept the steamer right on her course, and when she was opposite the fort, he saluted with the whistle and added an extra toot as a farewell to the Confederacy. Now, that last part I don't know about because we have indication from the Confederates inside the fort that they believe it, they buy it, and that for two big reasons. One, he gives what they consider the correct whistle signals, which they say is a short, long pattern. So they believe that he has given the correct signal to pass right by, and he has the people on the boat will say that he has worn the captain's hat as the right silhouette in the dark. So it's between 3 and 4 a.m. It's tough to see anyone's face from that distance in the dark, but you can, and not to mention seeing that they're African American, but they could see the hat, and so they let the planter go right by. At that point, I don't know exactly what they thought, but whatever the metaphorical equivalent of a car gunning it across the finish line is going to be, they know that they've passed by their primary biggest obstacle at Fort Sumter. And if they can make it to a U.S. flag on one of the nearby vessels and avoid the United States perceiving them as a threat instead of an ally, then they can make it. And the version that is given in the official records is that Robert Smalls' wife raised a white bedsheet in order to signal to the men on the USS Onward, the U.S. vessel that they were escaping to, that they were friends, not foes, and that they had delivered this boat to the United States.
I want to back up for just a second. When you talk about, getting close to the fort, the women are crying, and like the moment of peril there to me just seems so incredible because as you know, like the currents through there are terrible. If
Yeah.
there are signs posted everywhere, be careful of dangerous currents. You've got people who probably don't know how to swim, certainly children who aren't going to know how to swim. So like, if there's a place for calamity, that's the spot.
Absolutely, and I think there's both a literal and a metaphorical importance to Fort Sumter in this story. That the literal is, yes, I mean, anyone who's studied the Underground Railroad and other circumstances knows the peril that is going and the just fear and uncertainty that are going to be on any journey out of slavery. And this particular bottleneck being a well-known, well-armed, famous position is absolutely going to be a serious threat to the survival of their mission should they be noticed. So one enjoyable book that I've read about this nonfiction by a woman named Kate Lineberry is called "Be Free or Die," and that's a quote from Robert Smalls. That's what he's willing to do. One way or another, there's not going to be a life in slavery at the end of this mission. He's either going to gain his freedom or he's going to die trying, and maybe so could his family members and the other members of his crew. On the metaphorical end, I think that there's a true importance on what Fort Sumter represents to our history that is pretty directly related to the Robert Smalls story. And one way to look at that is through what happens if you get to a U.S. flag? In 1860, before the firing on Fort Sumter, before the start of the Civil War, if there's no war going on, and Robert Smalls decides that he is going to go to one of the U.S. forts, let's say Fort Moultrie, which was the main occupied one, and say that I'm no longer free because I've made it to a United States flag. There's no way that's going to happen. He's going to be laughed out of the room and be returned into a life of slavery, because the United States flag, I would say, for an African American in 1860, can't really represent, for an enslaved African American at least, it cannot represent the freedoms that we all take for granted and the freedoms that are promised in our founding documents. It is because of what happens at Fort Sumter and the Confederates firing on Fort Sumter and beginning a war that they say is in defense of their slave system, that the United States government is going to say, okay, now we are injuring the Confederate war effort if we begin helping people like Robert Smalls escape. So when he makes it past the place where the Civil War began and the place where this opportunity is going to arise for him in a way, and he makes it to a US flag, he is really representing, I think, the way that our country changes through the American Civil War, the opportunity for emancipation under a United States flag, which will culminate, of course, in the 13th Amendment on the tail end of the war.
And maybe we can touch on this a little bit, but this incident is one of those things that helps persuade Lincoln, like, oh, look, we should be taking advantage of African Americans as part of this war effort, which at this point in the war in May of 1862 is not really something he's embracing.
Yes. So I will mention that this isn't, and this leads into your point, that this is not the only escape in Charleston Harbor from slavery during the Civil War. There were actually some people who managed to do something like this just 2 weeks earlier. They escaped to a vessel called the USS Beyondville. And I think that in a way, the soldiers the sailors on the Beyondville didn't know what they had. Like in the example of Robert Smalls, they are going to take the military intelligence that, quote, 15 contrabands were able to provide. That they had taken a small boat that used to belong to the quartermaster's department of the rebel army. So these men are also resourceful and also making it to a U.S. vessel. But I think that the someone up the chain, whether it be Samuel DuPont, who leads U.S. naval forces in the Charleston area and who publicizes this in the official records, or whether it be someone else, I think they understand what they have in terms of a victory in the propaganda war and in the story that they have on their hands. So Robert Smalls' story is going to be featured the next month in Harper's Weekly in June of 1862, with a picture of him, with a picture of the planter, and the headline "Stole a Whole Vessel." And you are then going to have Robert Smalls settle into a mixture of, one, fighting alongside the United States Navy. He is going to sail the planter to many places where the U.S. is going to be performing naval operations, and two, traveling the country and the northern states in order to tell his story, begin recruiting African Americans who may want to be soldiers. And in August of 1862, meeting with the Lincoln administration in Washington, D.C. We believe that he did meet President Lincoln, but we don't know too much about his meeting with the president himself. But we do know a bit about his meeting with Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. And Kate Lineberry writes in her book, she has a letter from Smalls' traveling companion named Mansfield French, who says that they were presenting a letter from General Rufus Saxton in Beaufort to the Secretary of War. And that is asking the Secretary of War to authorize the raising of 5,000 African American troops. And the Secretary of War agrees to this request, which is the first time that the Lincoln administration had agreed to a request like this one. We don't know what Secretary of War Stanton was thinking, but you've got to think that you have right in front of you, literally delivering this letter, a man who has proven beyond the shadow of a doubt that African Americans are able and willing to fight for the United States, even if they had been consigned to a life of slavery beforehand, maybe especially if. And so the regiment that will come out of that will be called the First South Carolina of African descent. It will be what we consider the first African American regiment of the war, and it can be put down at least in part to Robert Smalls's voyage.
And I guess it's important for us to kind of consider that the Navy was integrated at this point.
Yes.
So for sailors to see Robert Small show up with a boat, maybe not such a big deal because there are
Hmm.
African Americans within the United States Army at that point. But it was a real hurdle to think about infantry, African Americans as infantry. Um,
Yes.
but ultimately it makes it into the final draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. So somewhere between
Absolutely.
August
Yep.
and the end of
Mhm.
December,
Yep.
Smalls and the
Yep.
other examples really kind of work their way into consciousness somehow.
Yes, and the timing of this certainly being right before that and right before the Battle of Antietam, which gives rise to the preliminary draft in September. Again, we don't have the direct evidence on to what extent they were thinking of him personally, but I think we can certainly connect some dots through his meeting with the President and Secretary of War of hey, putting this into the back of people's heads. The remainder of the sailors on the planter, many of them are also going to continue fighting. And with the National Park Service, a man named Chris Barr at Reconstruction Era National Historical Park in Beaufort, where Smalls lived for much of his life, has done some outstanding research on the other people who were on the planter. And those people are going to, in many cases, continue to go off and fight. A man named William Morrison, will join the Combahee River Raid the following year, which is famous for Harriet Tubman's participation and freedom for 700 people on plantations near Beaufort being freed by these raiders. You're going to have a man named Abraham Jackson who will join the second South Carolina of African descent. And you'll see a man named Gabriel Turner who will eventually become one of the famous Buffalo Soldiers out west. So even the people who are accomplishing this are going to go on to continue to put their lives on the line for the United States. In Robert Small's case, in a naval context, and for these men, proving that yes, black soldiers can be infantry, just like anyone else.
Uh, why is it that we know about Robert Small's story, but not, for instance, the escape that happened a few weeks earlier, or some of these other great stories
Mhm.
from the planner that you're sharing?
Mhm. I think some of it does have to do with with just which ships figured out quickly that they had an amazing story on their hands that could be shared, and some of it will come down to what happens next and how Robert Smalls will parlay this escape into a larger political career. I think that in the years after during the Civil War, his escape is going to be well known across the country. After the Civil War, I think he's going to be a hero to many African Americans in South Carolina for leading the charge in many ways as a person who will stand up for African American rights during and even after Reconstruction. And I think that is to the extent that he is very well known, and I think the crests of his fame have been during the Civil War, during his lifetime, and then again right now. I think that unfortunately his story kind of fe- fell into a category that maybe the Civil War centennial era might not wanted to have emphasized as a larger meaning for the war. But I think with the rediscovery of emancipation stories, I think his has gained much, much. Let me rephrase this. Much deserved publicity in more recent years. So I think that his larger fame has to do with what they discovered at that moment, but also what it stood for on a larger basis.
You mentioned he parlays this into a political career, and there's this brief
Mhm.
shining moment where
Yes.
it looks like
Mhm.
Reconstruction is going to go one way, And he's a
Yes.
real important part of that.
Yeah.
Um, and then things go south.
Yes. So another like in terms of the changing meanings of freedom in his country, uh, the escape to the U.S. flag is going to change is going to in some ways irrevocably change things, and the end of slavery will bring about more incredible and important changes in Charleston and beyond. But yes, the sad the both the important and at the end, I think the sad part of his story is that he lives long enough to see many of those advances effectively rolled back by a state that decided to basically disenfranchise African Americans. He is in 1868. He is involved with the drafting of a new South Carolina Constitution, and this is the first South Carolina Constitution that will provide for mandatory public education in the state of South Carolina, and it will be the opportunity for African Americans to participate in the political system en masse, really for the first time. He gets elected to his first term in Congress. He'll serve parts of 5 terms in the year 1874. So this is still with U.S. troops here in the South. He gets reelected in 1876, and he leaves Congress and comes back. He is in office at one time or another until the late 1880s.
Wow.
So that is after U.S. troops have left the South, and you kind of have an in between period for a little while after the election of 1876, which is one of the most controversial elections in our country's history, both on the presidential level with the bargain between Hayes and Tilden that will remove soldiers from the South, but also in South Carolina with the election by a razor thin violence margin of a man named Wade Hampton, who is a Confederate general. Robert Smalls, under the Wade Hampton status quo, will continue to be able to basically be in the one district in South Carolina that's going to continue electing a black representative for several years after this, or is capable of doing so. But eventually, this is going to go by the wayside too. In 1890, he's going to publish a journal article in, let's see, called the North American Review, that is going to be decrying the tactics that by then the state of South Carolina and members of what was the Democratic Party, which at the time had been the legacy of the Confederacy, which are trying to disenfranchise African Americans in the state. He will then go to another constitutional convention, but this one a lot less triumphant than the one he had once been at. In 1895, he's going to be at a convention that's going to be dominated by a man named Ben Tillman. And if under Hampton, you could maybe still get elected as a black representative in an exceptional circumstance, under Tillman, that's going to be impossible. And you're going to see the rise of the poll taxes and literacy tests that are ultimately going to be the death knell for African American voting in South Carolina. And Robert Smalls is going to call attention to that throughout the convention. He's going to poke at the people who are taking away rights of people like him. He is going to give speeches like decrying what they are doing. But he and the other 6 black representatives at the convention are going to be defeated, and the state is going to be plunged into the Jim Crow era. So it is in that way his story is a sad one. At the end of his life, he'll die in the 1910s after a thankfully long career as the head of the port in Beaufort, South Carolina, as the customs collector there. But a person who is born around his death is going to be middle-aged at the time of the next big successful civil rights struggle in the 1950s and 60s. So it's never too far away. And
Yeah.
Robert Smalls' life goes through the lows of being born into slavery, the amazing accomplishments that he is able to help people achieve, and the fragility of Southern democracy in the years after the Civil War. And I think we can all take some lessons from that.
I love your statement that it's never too far away, because it sure isn't it?
Yeah.
Do we know what happened to his family?
Yeah, so he stayed married to Hannah, his wife, for many years afterwards. Real quick, let me double check my notes here. She passed away in 1883, so about 20 years after the Civil War. One of his daughter Elizabeth, who was the older of his two kids who were on the planter, is going to live for a very long time, actually, and that is relevant to what I just said. Dies in 1959 at the age of 101 years old. So she dies after the Montgomery bus boycott,
Wow.
which I think goes to that point and is pretty remarkable. Um, he will move back to Beaufort. So in addition to being an important figure in Charleston's Civil War story, he is an important figure in Beaufort's Civil War story. That is where Rufus Saxton will raise the first black regiments of the war. And it is one of the first places the U.S. had taken back on the coastline. So it's the center for experiments and emancipation. And one of those, in a way, is the United States is going to be taking the property of the Confederates who had basically skedaddled from the city in 1861 that are now sitting vacant, and they're going to hold auctions on them. And Robert Smalls was going to buy one of those homes, which was the McKee House, the home in which he had been enslaved. So he is going to go from an enslaved worker in that house to the man of the house.
Wow. Wow.
Yep.
That's a pretty neat story.
Yes, indeed.
So let me put you on the spot as tour guide for a moment.
Yeah.
You're the local expert. So aside from this great story, Charleston's, I mean, just chock full of great Civil War stories. What else would you recommend people investigate if they happen to be able to come to the city and explore Civil War history?
Well, you've got a national park site that encompasses both Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie at the mouth of the harbor. So you can see where the Civil War began, and you can pretty directly understand why it is still important today. The park rangers out there do an outstanding job. They raise the flag and lower the flag each day at Fort Sumter, which is a cool opportunity that I've been happy to participate in. We around the city, you can see historic houses and markers like the one you mentioned of Robert Smalls. You can see plantation sites in the area, and the plantation sites often have a long and complicated history, but you can see the African American story through many of those plantation sites. Boone Hall has a gullah presentation and cultural tour. McLeod has history that really dives into the long legacy of sharecropping in the South after the Civil War, and how long many of the descendants of enslaved workers were stuck there. Magnolia, Middleton, and Drayton Hall have some original buildings. Drayton Hall has their original house, and all of them do have tours that dive into both people who own the plantations and the people who did the work. So yeah, I would definitely emphasize that Charleston is like an amazing city to come to understand why, to understand for any Civil War battle you go to, why were people dying on these fields? Why did the Confederates believe so strongly in secession? Charleston, for a lot of them, was what they aspired to. And you can, like, the beauty of the city, I think, like illustrates some of why they would have seen it as a symbol for themselves, but also the emancipation of African Americans, I think, can be seen in Charleston almost like maybe no other place. So I definitely would encourage people to come down.
A real interesting sight to me is, if you go to the visitor center to catch the ferry in town,
Mhm.
the area around that, the Freedom Plaza, uh,
Yeah, the site I believe is called Liberty Square,
Liberty Square. There it is. I knew it was
and it originally, and it has a long history as well. So the transatlantic slave trade, not slavery as a whole, but the slave trade, is legally abolished in the year 1808, and that because of a city ordinance and because Charleston had basically been narrowed down as the last big city in the United States taking part in the slave trade. That wharf, which was then called Gadsden's Wharf, is going to be the home to it is going to be the home to the final port of debarkation legally on the transatlantic slave trade. But it's going to go from that to eventually become a National Park Service site that will dive into the history we've been talking about. and ultimately the beginning of the Civil War.
Yeah. And right around the corner from there, there's a monument to the Liberty Tree that had been in Charleston. And so to me, like that's all just a really
Mhm.
interesting
Absolutely, yes.
juxtaposition, you know, because
Hmm.
you're thinking about liberty,
And
you're thinking about freedom. What does that
right,
actually mean? Who does that mean that for? And those are
yeah,
really great things to
and
think about as you're walking in
yeah,
those footsteps of
and
history.
Charleston's patriots during the Revolution did amazing things. They managed to throw off the tyranny of a king, and like not on their own, but as part of a larger picture. And I think it's less of a like we don't we don't need to think poorly of their entire person to understand that the the legacy of the country they helped create is growing beyond just the liberty that they stood for. They understood for liberty. They stood for liberty in many important ways, and the Civil War doesn't diminish that; it grows it through the achievements of people like Robert Smalls.
Yeah, that's a wonderful way of putting that, you know, and
Yeah,
that expansiveness. And I think that's one reason why then a place like that can resonate with us today, because then it brings us into that conversation and asks us, what does that mean today? You know, and
yeah, absolutely.
yeah. So, anything else before we wrap up? Anything I forgot to ask you, Walt?
Let me think. I would mention that there are more escapes throughout the Civil War, not just the two I mentioned, but that will come to Morris Island later in the Civil War. Morris Island, for many of your listeners, will be famous for as the site at the end of the movie Glory. So that's the site of Battery or Fort Wagner, with one of those early Black regiments storming a Confederate-held position. And once the U.S. does take that island, they will take the island, which will lead to a lot of destruction, the bombardment of the Confederate positions in the city of Charleston. But it will also be another haven for people escaping. And one other account I've run across mentions that a person escaping mentions a person escaping on the 4th of July, which I think is awesome, and mentions one of 12 escapees who landed at Battery Strong, which was the renaming of Wagner under U.S. control. That one of them had escaped from a man named H.P. Lassane, who had been the Confederate commander of Castle Pinckney.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, that's all I know about that story. But I think if we ever did find out more about that, I think how that person or and how those 12 people managed to get out from under the Confederates' noses in that case would be an awesome story to be able to dive into.
Yeah,
And
wow.
I know the Robert Small story has also been like it's one of those where people who discuss this with me at in my tour guiding position will often say this should be a movie, and I don't know of any direct movies about it. Although I know someone's bought rights, but it's been long in the works. But I do know of books. I know of a play that was featured in Charleston a couple years ago. I know of a U.S. Navy ship called the USS Robert Smalls, which was rechristened a few years ago. And I know of an episode of the guilty pleasure, but very, very fun TV show, Drunk History, that features his escape. So I'm glad that more people have been discovering the story beyond the confines of Charleston. And I certainly hope that that will continue to be remembered and honored.
Yeah. And before we wrap up, I want to give you a quick little shout out. So last semester, I taught a Civil War class and had a bunch of guest speakers Zoom in. And Walt, you were my students' favorite of all semester.
Awesome.
They
Cool.
loved
Thank
you.
you.
They loved you, man. So thank you,
Excellent.
thank you so much for doing that for me.
Of course, I'm always always happy to talk to ener- energized learners.
So well, you certainly energized them. Well, Walt, thanks for being with us today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me on. And I promise my next emerging Civil War post. It's way late, but it'll be up there.
Looking forward to it, my friend. I'm Chris
Yep.
Mikowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.